Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Zachary Taylor, and the focus is contentious compromise. The year is 1849. It's Taylor's first year as President of the United States, and the country is focused primarily on one major topic of political discourse, and it had to do with whether or not the United States was going to permit slavery in the vast new territories that had recently been acquired from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. During this first year of Taylor's presidency, Congress was out of session, which was the norm, and the president decided to go on a speaking tour to meet the people, make a few statements. Mostly this was relatively benign stuff. But in August of 1849, he dropped a line in a speech in Mercer, Pennsylvania that was a shockwave to the country when the President of the United States said ever so simply that the people of the North need have no apprehension of the further extension of slavery. Well, this was a bombshell statement, particularly for the people in the South. The South thought they had some kinship with Zachary Taylor. He was one of them, a Southerner and a slaveholder. They thought, even though he had never really spoken publicly on these topics, they just assumed that he was with them and was going to support the expansion of slavery. It's not where Zachary Taylor stood. In fact, he didn't think that the geography supported the concept of slavery very much in the Mexican cession lands, nor did he think it was going to be good for the country. And he was telling the North, in his opinion, they had nothing to worry about. Well, this was obviously going to be a very divisive issue when Congress came back into session in December of 1849, and it was a divisive Congress from the very beginning. It took the House of Representatives 62 ballots to choose a speaker before eventually going with a pro-union Democrat from Georgia by the name of Howell Cobb. It was so divisive, it took the House 14 ballots to choose a House doorkeeper. That's how difficult things were going to be in this United States Congress. Well, Zachary Taylor had an opinion about how to manage this particular conflict because his goal was peace, preserve the Union, avoid mass controversies. And so he had developed his president's plan. His president's plan was to bring the new territories into the Union as quickly as possible and bring them in as states, like Texas had done. Bypass the territorial status. The reason was that Congress had governance over territories in the United States, and if they come in as territories, then Congress would be deciding issues like slavery. If they came in immediately as states, then the locals in California or New Mexico would decide for themselves whether or not they would support slavery, and the rest of the country, including the politicians in Washington, would stay out of this mix. Taylor also wanted to make sure that these issues were local and small. He didn't want a grand discussion around slavery, which was kind of bubbling up in Congress, taking on other contentious issues beyond just the ones dealing with the lands from the Mexican cession. According to Taylor, his plan was laying its foundation in such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, there being the states or territories in the West, while abstaining from the introduction of those exciting topics of a sectional character which have hitherto produced painful apprehensions in the public mind, all of which Zachary Taylor simply wanted to avoid, and he could best avoid that by keeping the partisans in Congress out of the mix. Well, California had already expressed its interest in coming into the Union as a state, kind of consistent with where Taylor was coming from, and they had expressed that they would do so without slavery. New Mexico wasn't quite ready. They weren't ready to come in as a state. They actually sought to come in as a territory, which would certainly bring Congress into the mix. And by the way, Congress didn't want to sit on the sidelines on this. They had strong passions on this topic. Decades of experience from stalwarts like Henry Clay and John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Thomas Benton. They've been arguing about this for years, and they were actually focused on this grand compromise, along with some of the newcomers. You've got Taylor's former brother and son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who's now a senator from Mississippi, weighing in on one side of the debate. You've got the former governor of New York, William Seward, very much on the other side of the debate. We're going to hear more on these debates in a future episode on the life of Millard Fillmore, as Vice President of the United States, sitting as President of the Senate actually oversaw most of these contentious debates. Well, amidst all of this rancor, Clay sought one last big compromise. And in fact, he did want to bring in not just the issue of slavery expansion into these territories, but some of the other long-standing issues related to slavery. And he simply felt that Taylor's president's plan was insufficient. According to Clay, I have seen with profound regret the president's persistence in his own peculiar plan. A week ago, I expected reciprocation. Entertaining that constitutional deference to the wisdom of Congress, which he had professed, Taylor ought to permit us to consider what is best for our common country. And sure enough, Taylor had said on domestic issues he was very much inclined to defer to Congress. But in this case, he thought Congress was actually more part of the problem than the solution, and so he wasn't really ready to just sit on the sidelines. Well, this was all going on. There was another issue that was really bringing the focus on this controversial topic, and it had to do with a land dispute between Texas and New Mexico over the boundaries that had been decided in this cession of land coming from Mexico as a result of the war. There were about 100,000 square miles that were sort of up for grabs in between what the New Mexicans thought were theirs and what the Texans thought were theirs. And this became a really hot issue because New Mexico's thinking on statehood had evolved. They're now leaning more toward coming in as a state, doing so without slavery. And as far as the Texans were concerned, this was their territory that was now in the mix of this discussion, and they were not inclined to simply have part of their territory, in their minds, be no longer available for slavery. So what did Zachary Taylor want to do? Again, his idea was bring them in as states, because as states, if there was a conflict between New Mexico and Texas as states, the Constitution said those conflicts go to the Supreme Court, a non-political branch. Perhaps it would be a more peaceful way to solve that conflict. If New Mexico came in as a territory, or in the current status right now, then Congress once again was going to be weighing in on these boundary lines and whether or not slavery was going to be permitted. The parties weren't waiting. In New Mexico, military governor John Munroe called for a convention to develop a plan for statehood and establish a constitution without slavery was what was going on. And as that petition was being routed to Congress, Texas, Peter Bell, the governor of Texas, was virulently opposed to this. And in fact, he was threatening violence to stop it. He meant business. Peter Bell said that he issued a call for military force sufficient to enable civil authorities to execute Texas laws without regard to the military power of the United States. A clash of arms was potentially in the midst for New Mexico and Texas in that disputed area, all of which was anathema to Zachary Taylor. He wasn't going to tolerate this. And in fact, he gave guidance to a Lieutenant Alfred Pleasanton, who was on his way to Santa Fe, that I have ordered the troops in New Mexico to be reinforced and directed that no armed force from Texas be permitted to go into that territory. The whole business is infamous and must be put down. Talk of civil war and secession was in the air because the rhetoric was really getting heated. A former supporter of Taylor's, Alexander Stephens, a congressman from Georgia, had flipped on Taylor when he made the earlier statement about the North needing not worry about the expansion of slavery. And now with what was going on between New Mexico and Texas, Stephens said the first federal gun that shall be fired against the people of Texas without the authority of law will be the signal for the free man from the Delaware to the Rio Grande to rally to the rescue. The cause of Texas in such a conflict will be the case of the entire South. You may yet live to see that 15 states of this union with 7 millions of people who, knowing their rights, dare maintain them, cannot be easily conquered. Again, this was talk of secession and civil war. In the meantime, Henry Clay moved forward. May 8, 1850, 3 bills were introduced in this grand compromise from Clay's perspective. 3 bills. The first, California would be admitted as a free state. New Mexico and Utah would come in as territories. Their governance would be overseen by Congress. The New Mexico-Texas border dispute would be resolved in favor of New Mexico, but Texas would get a one-time payment as compensation. The second bill was the passage of a stringent fugitive slave law, which required the captured runaways to be returned to their masters from wherever they went in the Union. And the third bill was to eliminate the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Slavery was still legal in Washington if this passed, but the slave trade would be eliminated. And Zachary Taylor was opposed to this. He thought most of it was unnecessary. It was just stirring up trouble with this broad measure. Keep it simple was Zachary Taylor's approach. Bring these places in as states, let them decide the issue of slavery, everyone else go about their business, preserve the Union. This is what he wanted to do in his president's plan, and he was thinking that if these bills came forward, he in fact was considering a veto. Early in his term, he said he wasn't really a fan of the veto, and he was going to give deference to Congress on domestic issues. But in this case, he thought it was destructive to the Union, potentially, and a veto was very much on his mind. Well, it never came to that, because the president got sick. The initial signs of his illness, July 3rd of 1850, and then on July 4th, Independence Day, he spent a couple of hours in the hot sun at the base of the Washington Monument, which was being built at the time for a celebration of Independence Day, the nation's birthday. He walked back to the White House in that hot sun and had a snack, some cherries or some other fruits, some ice-cold milk, and by dinner time, the president had cramps. Wasn't getting better. The diagnosis was cholera morbus, but it was more likely just acute gastroenteritis. The weather and the water system in the nation's capital was never great. This was swampland. People got sick a lot, and so there was a possibility that that's what caused the illness. We never really knew exactly for sure, but we do know that when the doctors came and whatever they tried, nothing was really responding, and by July 9th, Taylor knew he was dying. He said that day, "I am about to die. I expect the summons soon. I have endeavored to discharge all my duties faithfully. I regret nothing, but am sorry that I'm about to leave my friends." Sure enough, that night, 10:30 that night, Zachary Taylor, President of the United States, was dead. The nation mourned its fallen hero. He had been a valiant soldier for 4 decades, didn't want to be President of the United States, but he was willing to answer that call when he was drafted into the position. These were contentious times, and his veto of those compromise measures pending could have actually created a conflict of arms right then and there in 1850. As it turned out, after his death, things changed because his vice president, Millard Fillmore, had a different view of these compromise measures, which were passed, and he signed them into law. The Texas-New Mexico issue was cast aside, it was resolved, and these overall issues on slavery seemed to be put aside as a result of the Compromise of 1850. Well, it was an elusive vision because that put aside was actually very, very temporary. The heated nature of the conflict between North and South over slavery was simply going to grow. That path to national fracture was already well paved, and sure enough, a decade later it would hit, but it did hit a snag and was stalled when Zachary Taylor died in July of 1850, cutting short his presidency just about a year and a half in. That is the life of Zachary Taylor and Contentious Compromise from the life of Zachary Taylor. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.